The first snow made Sawtooth Valley look peaceful, but Miles Corbin knew winter could hide damage better than darkness. He came home to bury his grandfather, sell the ranch, and leave before the past could ask anything of him. Then he found Rye, his aging German shepherd, half frozen beside a broken stone wall. Rye remembered Miles, but instead of following him home, the old dog turned back toward a silent irrigation ditch. For months he had guarded that place through hunger, storms, and passing survey trucks. What Miles uncovered was not only a stolen water right, but a choice his grandfather had made that could divide an entire valley. Tell us where you're watching from, share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. The first snow of winter had made Sawtooth Valley look innocent. It lay in clean white bands along the Salmon River, softened the old fence posts, and brightened the roofs of barns that had spent decades leaning into mountain wind. Beyond the valley floor, dark firs climbed the lower slopes, and the distant peaks rose blue and sharp beneath a sky so clear it seemed newly made. Miles Corbin distrusted beautiful mornings. At 46, he had lived long enough to know that light could hide damage better than darkness ever tried to. He drove north in an aging dark green pickup, one hand resting loosely on the wheel. He was a little over 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, but built more like a swimmer than a weightlifter. Long arms, a deep chest, and the compact strength of a man accustomed to ladders, ropes, narrow decks, and bad footing. His olive-drab combat shirt fit close through the torso. The sleeves carried faded woodland camouflage and 2 dark horizontal bands around each upper arm, markings worn pale by salt, friction, and years. Over it, he wore an open waxed field jacket, dark green with a brown corduroy collar. Wind had pushed the longer top of his ash-brown hair to one side, exposing the silver at both temples. A thin scar cut diagonally through his right eyebrow. His nose leaned slightly left from an old break. A short beard shadow, brown threaded with gray, roughened his jaw without hiding the tired depth of his face. Every few minutes, Miles tilted his head to the right. It was not curiosity. It was habit. The ringing had begun 3 years earlier after an explosion aboard a security vessel in the North Pacific. Doctors called it permanent tinnitus, as if naming the thing made it easier to live with. To Miles, it was a narrow metallic scream that existed behind every sound. In crowded rooms, voices tangled together. In quiet places, the ringing grew bold. Snow country was quiet. That made it worse. He had returned to Sawtooth Valley because Elias Corbin was dead. His grandfather had been buried 2 days earlier while Miles was still crossing Wyoming, delayed by ice and one closed highway. The funeral had gone on without him. That fact sat beside him in the truck, more heavily than any luggage. He had come for paperwork now. Probate, livestock records, the sale of the ranch, nothing more. He would walk through the house, sign what needed signing, arrange for the remaining sheep to be transferred, and leave before the valley remembered him too clearly. That was the plan. Plans had once been his specialty. 7 years earlier, Miles had left Rye with Elias for what was supposed to be 18 months. Rye had been retired early after a shoulder injury ended his working career. The German shepherd already knew the ranch, knew Elias, and had spent summer weeks there whenever Miles was between assignments. 18 months had become 3 years. Then 5, then 7. Miles had sent money for veterinary care and food. He had called. At first every Sunday, then every other Sunday, then when he could tolerate hearing the worry Elias tried to hide. After the explosion, the calls became harder. Elias would ask whether the ringing was better. Miles would say yes. Elias would ask when he was coming home. Miles would say soon. A lie could become a shelter if a man stayed beneath it long enough. He told himself he was sparing his grandfather the sight of what remained of him. The balance problems, the sleeplessness. the way he sometimes smiled and nodded because he had not understood a word spoken across a table. The truth was smaller and less honorable. Miles had been afraid. The road curved along a line of bare cottonwoods, their branches shining with frost. The Corbin property appeared beyond them in pieces. The gray roof of the house, a sagging lambing shed, the old red barn faded almost brown, and the stone boundary wall Elias's father had built by hand. Miles slowed. Something moved near the northern section of the wall. At first he thought it was a scrap of black plastic caught between the stones. Then the shape lifted its head. Miles hit the brake. The truck slid half a length before the tires caught. A dog's face protruded through a broken gap in the wall. The muzzle was silvered. Frost clung to the whiskers. The black and gold coat hung in frozen ridges around the neck, and one amber-brown eye watched the truck without blinking. Miles forgot the ringing. Rye. The name did not feel spoken. It felt torn loose. He was out of the truck before the engine stopped shuddering. His boots broke through the snow crust as he crossed the roadside ditch. Rye did not run to him. That was the first wound. The dog had once covered open ground, like released weather. He had been fast enough to climb a training wall before Miles finished giving the command, powerful enough to drag a grown man from shallow surf, and proud enough to sulk for an hour if anyone called him old. Now Rye stood behind the wall, with his weight shifted away from his right rear leg. His body was thin beneath the heavy coat. The old black saddle across his back was divided by the narrow golden line Miles remembered, but his ribs showed when he breathed. His left ear still carried the small V-shaped notch near the upper edge. Around his right eye, the pale crescent of gold remained visible beneath grime and frost. Those details were worse than uncertainty. They made recognition absolute. Miles stopped several feet away and lowered one hand. Rye's ears moved. For a moment, neither of them crossed the distance. Miles felt the old fear rise. Not fear that Rye would bite, but fear that the dog would not know him. 7 years was a long time in a human life. In a dog's life, it was almost an age. Then Rye stepped forward. 3 even steps. The fourth shorter, his familiar damaged rhythm. The dog reached Miles and pressed his forehead into the center of Miles's palm. No leap, no bark, no wild circling joy. Only the weight of an old head and one slow breath against his skin. Miles crouched. His other hand came up, hovering near Rye's neck, afraid of hurting him. "I'm sorry," he said. The words vanished into the bright morning. Rye closed his eyes once, then he pulled away. The reunion had lasted less than 10 seconds. Rye turned back toward the wall, pushed his muzzle through the broken opening, and stared across the snow toward an old irrigation channel. Miles remained crouched behind him. Something colder than the air settled in his chest. Rye had known him. Rye had forgiven him, or at least had not refused him. And still, whatever lay beyond that wall mattered more. Miles moved around the fallen stones. On the inside, the ground dipped toward an old maintenance recess built into the embankment. He remembered Elias storing shovels there during spring runoff. Now a rough wooden crate had been turned on its side beneath the overhang. Straw filled the interior. 2 dented bowls sat near the entrance, one empty and one holding a skin of ice. The shelter was crude but deliberate. Elias had made this place for Rye, or someone had maintained it after Elias could no longer come. The snow around the shelter was crossed with tracks. Rye had left during the night, probably toward the cottonwoods or lower channel, but every trail curved back to the wall. Miles touched one of the prints. New snow had softened its edges. Rye had not been trapped here. He had chosen to return. An engine approached from the east. Miles barely heard it through the ringing, but Rye did. The dog rose at once, his head lowered, shoulders tightening despite his weakness. A square-bodied delivery van came around the bend, pale blue beneath a coat of road salt. Rye did not retreat into the shelter. He stepped in front of the broken section of wall. The van stopped a careful distance away. A woman climbed out carrying a covered metal bowl in one hand and a thermos in the other. She looked to be in her late 30s, sturdy rather than delicate, with the balanced build of someone who lifted boxes instead of discussing exercise. Her mustard-colored puffer jacket stood bright against the snow. A green hoodie showed beneath it, and a brick-red bandana was tied around her right wrist. Her reddish-brown hair had been pulled into a low knot, though one damp curl had escaped and rested against a freckled cheek. She took one look at Miles, then at the truck, then at Rye. "You're Elias's grandson," she said. It was not a question. Miles Corbin. Nora Bellwether. He knew the name. Bellwether Mercantile had been in Chalice Crossing before Miles was born. Nora set the bowl down without approaching Rye. Then she unscrewed the thermos and poured warm water into the less damaged dish. Rye watched every movement. "You've been feeding him," Miles said, "for 3 weeks that I know of." The answer struck harder than he expected. Nora straightened. Her green-gray eyes did not soften to make the truth easier. "I started seeing him before sunrise when I drove the delivery road. Gideon Pike, he handles most of my store deliveries, helped replace the straw after the last storm. Rye won't let either of us touch him." Miles looked toward the shelter. "How often does he leave?" "Sometimes at night. There are tracks toward the creek and the old hayfield, but he's always back by morning." She paused, glancing at Rye. "Even during the worst snow?" Miles looked at the dog standing between them and the broken wall. Nora folded her arms against the cold. "I thought he was waiting for your grandfather." Rye's head shifted suddenly. Far down the county road, a diesel engine growled. This time Miles heard only a dull fluctuation beneath the ringing. Rye heard everything. The German shepherd stepped forward until his chest nearly touched the stones. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his gaze fixed on a white survey truck moving beyond the tree line. The truck did not turn toward the ranch. Rye watched until it disappeared. Only then did he lower himself again. Nora's expression changed. "He does that every time." "Every time what?" "One of those trucks passes." Miles studied the wall. Rye's paw marks formed repeated paths through the snow, not toward the ranch house, not toward the barn, not toward the road Elias would have used to come home. Every path curved around the same section of stone. Miles followed the line of Rye's gaze. Beyond the wall, the old irrigation channel ran white and silent beneath the snow. A few weathered posts marked its edge. One leaned at an unnatural angle. At the foot of it, the snow had been disturbed. Miles crossed the gap and knelt. Rye followed as far as the wall, then stopped. Miles brushed away loose snow with his glove. His fingers struck metal. He dug farther and uncovered a broken piece of blue-painted signage, bent nearly in half. Rust scarred the edges where bolts had been forced free. Most of the lettering was gone. 2 words remained. "Diversion Gate." Miles looked back at Rye. The dog stood framed by the broken wall, old body rigid, amber eyes fixed beyond him. Not on the house, not on the road. On the frozen channel. Miles had arrived, believing Rye had survived, by waiting for a dead man to return. He understood now that he had mistaken loyalty for grief. Rye was not waiting. He was guarding something. Miles rose slowly, the broken sign in his hand. Behind him, the Corbin house stood cold beneath its white roof. The sale documents were still inside his truck. He could sign them, leave the valley, and let another man inherit whatever question Rye had kept alive through the snow. For 7 years, Miles had mistaken distance for protection. He would not make that mistake again. He carried the piece of sign back toward the wall. "I'm not selling," he said. Nora studied him, perhaps measuring whether the words would survive the morning. Rye lowered his head and rested it briefly against the stone. The wall had not slept. Now neither would Miles. By noon, the Corbin ranch had begun to reveal the truth beneath the snow. From the road, it still looked almost respectable. The farmhouse stood square against the mountains, its weathered boards silvered by winter. The barn leaned only slightly. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney after Miles coaxed life into the old stove. But distance had always been generous to damaged things. Up close, the sheep pens sagged where fence posts had rotted below the frost line. A downspout had split and frozen into a crooked spear of ice. The main water pipe from the north pasture wore 3 separate patches, each one wrapped in wire and old rubber like a bone set by someone too poor to call a doctor. Inside the hay barn, less than a quarter of the loft remained full. Miles stood beneath the rafters and looked at the empty space. He did not know much about running sheep, but he knew stores, fuel, food, medical supplies, anything meant to carry living bodies through a hard season. This ranch had entered winter without enough of anything. A truck came across the lower field before he finished inspecting the barn. Miles noticed it first as movement through the open doors, then felt the low vibration through the frozen ground. Rye noticed before both. The old German shepherd rose from the folded blanket Miles had placed near the barn wall. His ears came forward, but his body did not tighten the way it had for the survey truck. He watched the approaching vehicle, then looked once at Miles. Not danger. Known. The truck was an old white Ford with one green door and a stock trailer behind it. A man climbed down wearing a dark brown shearling coat, faded jeans, and a canvas cap repaired across the crown with red thread. Amos Weller had the compact, weathered shape of someone who had spent more years bending into wind than standing away from it. At 63, his back had begun to round, but his shoulders remained thick. A white beard covered most of his square face, cut shorter on one side, as though grooming had been interrupted by livestock and never resumed. He closed the truck door with one hip. "So," he said, looking at Miles. The prodigal paperwork arrived. Miles did not smile. "Amos? You remember me? I remember you accusing me of stealing peaches when I was 12. You were stealing peaches? I was checking if they were ripe." Amos chewed the end of a toothpick, considering the defense. Still guilty. The exchange might once have become a laugh. Now it only rested between them, a small thing from a less complicated life. Amos looked past Miles toward Rye. The toothpick stopped moving. "Well," he said quietly, "there you are." He did not approach the dog. That earned him more trust than kindness would have. Rye lowered himself back onto the blanket. Amos nodded once, as if they had reached an agreement. "The rest of the flock is at my place," he said. 27 ewes, 2 old rams, 6 yearlings. I moved them after Elias went to the hospital. How many were here last winter? 74. Miles turned toward the nearly empty loft. What happened? Water happened. Amos said it without drama. In the West, water did not need drama. It already had law, money, ancestry, weather, and men willing to lie about all 4. They walked through the lower pens while Amos explained. The decline had begun late in summer. The north pasture dried first. Then the ditch feeding the middle trough lost pressure. Elias hauled water with an old tanker until the truck's transmission failed. He bought hay at twice the usual price, sold 31 sheep before the market dropped even farther. A few of the oldest ewes died during the hot spell, Amos said. Not all at once. They weakened. One got down and never stood again. Elias blamed himself for everyone. Why didn't he tell me? Amos stopped near a trough split down the middle by ice. He did. Miles looked at him. Amos pulled the toothpick from his mouth. "He called you from my kitchen in August, said his landline was acting up." Miles remembered the call. A bad connection, Elias asking whether Miles had time, Miles answering that he had 9 minutes before a briefing. They had discussed a furnace part. The weather? Rye's appetite. Not sheep, not water. Miles had filled every silence before Elias could put anything difficult into it. "He didn't say the ranch was failing," Miles said. "No," Amos replied, "and you didn't ask why a man who'd fixed his own equipment for 60 years suddenly needed advice about a furnace relay." The words were not cruelly delivered. That made them harder to resist. Miles looked down at the frozen trough. The ringing in his ears rose until it seemed to sharpen the edges of the world. Behind him, Rye moved. Miles did not hear the dog's nails against the hard ground, but he felt Rye's shoulder touch the side of his leg. A light pressure. Not comfort, exactly. "Contact." Miles let his hand fall toward the dog. Rye stood still beneath it. Amos looked away, granting them privacy without leaving. "Preston Cade came by after the funeral," he said. "Left papers at the house." "What kind of papers?" "Offered to buy the ranch, land and water together." Miles's hand stopped on Rye's neck. Why would he move that fast? Because grief makes people sign things. Amos bent and knocked ice from the trough with his boot. "Cade has been buying water shares from everyone between here and the South Fork. Calls himself a broker. Talks like a banker. Dresses like the weather is something happening to other people." "For what?" "Resort project. Lodges, heated paths, private ponds, all the usual ways rich people pay to pretend winter is comfortable." Amos spat the toothpick into the snow. Elias fought him for months. Then near the end, he stopped talking about it. "Gave up?" Amos looked toward the northern wall. "No. Your grandfather never gave up quietly." That sentence followed Miles back to the house. By late afternoon, Nora returned with food for Rye, a bag of rice, 2 cans of pumpkin, and Dr. Helen Crowder. Helen arrived in a mud-splashed veterinary truck and walked in carrying a red-brown leather medical bag. She was 50, broad-shouldered, with ash-blonde hair cut blunt at the jaw. A small white scar marked her left cheek. She wore a sand-colored barn coat over a denim shirt, and her calm had none of the softness people often mistook for compassion. She looked at Rye for less than 10 seconds before turning to Miles. "Don't ask me if he's fine." Miles had not yet spoken. Helen crouched sideways to Rye rather than facing him directly. She allowed him to smell the back of her hand, then opened her bag. "He's alive," she said. "That's different." Rye accepted the examination because Miles remained near his head. Helen checked his gums, joints, old shoulder injury, hydration, spine, paws, and the stiffness in his right rear leg. When Rye grew uneasy, Miles raised one hand, palm down. "Stay." The signal had once held Rye motionless beneath helicopter noise, gunfire, and surf. Now it steadied him in an old kitchen while snowlight moved across the floor. Rye watched Miles's hand and stopped trembling. The moment struck Miles with unexpected force. Human voices had become unreliable to him. Words disappeared behind ringing, distance, embarrassment. Yet Rye still understood the language they had built before either of them grew old. Miles lowered 2 fingers. "Easy." Rye released a slow breath. Helen glanced between them but did not interrupt. When she finished, she stood and washed her hands at the sink. Malnourished, dehydrated, arthritis in the hips, old shoulder damage aggravated by cold and overuse. No fractures, no fresh trauma. I don't see evidence that someone beat him. Nora had been leaning against the counter, arms folded. "But he's been suffering?" "Yes," Helen said. "Neglect doesn't need bruises." She wrote a feeding schedule on the back of an old grocery receipt. Small portions, warm water, joint medication, limited walking, no heroic reunion hikes through the snow. "He'll improve," Helen said. "But 11-year-old working dogs do not become 5 again because the right person finally comes home." Miles felt Nora look at him. He kept his eyes on the paper. After Helen left, Nora began measuring food into a pot. "You can go," Miles said. "So can you." He turned. Nora did not look up. She stirred rice into warm broth with a wooden spoon. "You've made that clear." Her tone was even, but the words entered the room like cold through a cracked frame. "I came back. For the estate. I came back. After Elias died." Miles's jaw tightened. Rye lifted his head from the blanket, sensing the shift. Nora set down the spoon. "I'm not saying you caused what happened here. You're working your way toward it. I'm saying he waited." Miles heard only part of the sentence. The ringing swallowed the middle. "What?" Nora turned away to reach for the pumpkin. He hated that. People facing away. Words lost in the room. The sudden need to choose between admitting he had not heard and pretending he had. "What did you say?" She looked back and saw something in his face, not anger alone. "Fear?" Miles spoke before pride could stop him. "I can't hear you when you turn away." The confession changed the room more than a shout would have. Nora's expression softened, but she did not offer pity. "All right," she said, facing him fully. "I said Elias waited." Miles looked down. "You don't know what those years were." "No." "The treatments, the ship, the noise in my head that never stops. I couldn't sleep, couldn't sit in a restaurant, couldn't follow a conversation unless I watched everyone's mouth." Nora stood quietly. "I didn't want him seeing me like that." "Like what?" Miles gestured toward himself, frustrated by the absence of a simple word. "Reduced." Nora's eyes held his. "Elias couldn't lift a feed sack his last year. His hands shook so badly he drank coffee through a lid." "Do you think he believed that made him less of a man?" "That's different." "No," she said. "That's why it hurts." Miles turned away. Nora continued, her voice quieter, but no gentler. "You and Elias were alike. You both treated silence as if it were a kindness. Mostly it just left the other person alone with the worst explanation." Rye rose from the blanket. He walked between them, 3 even steps, and 1 shortened, then sat with his side pressed against Miles's boot. Miles looked down at him. Rye had waited for hand signals. Elias had waited for a call. Perhaps loyalty was not proven by how long someone remained. Perhaps it was measured by whether the other person ever returned before waiting became all they had left. Nora turned back to the stove. After a while, she said, "My store is in debt." Miles looked up. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. She kept stirring, though the food no longer needed it. Bellwether Mercantile lost 3 farm accounts this year. 2 families moved. 1 sold to Cade. If the ranches keep failing and his resort controls the new development, my store won't survive spring. So feeding Rye was business? Nora's face hardened. No. The answer came without hesitation. I fed Rye because I couldn't drive past him and still respect myself, but when I learned whose dog he was, I hoped you might come back and stay long enough to stop Cade. Miles considered her. At least that part is honest. I'm too tired to be noble. For the first time, he almost smiled. It did not last, but Nora noticed. That evening, after Rye ate and finally slept near the stove, Miles entered Elias's office. The room smelled of cedar dust, paper, and the faint medicinal sweetness of cough drops. Nothing had been arranged for death. A pair of reading glasses lay open beside the lamp. A wool shirt hung over the chair. A coffee ring marked the corner of a county map. Miles opened drawers. He found veterinary receipts for Rye, water hauling invoices, feed bills, medical statements, and letters addressed to him but never mailed. Some began with ordinary things. Weather turned. Rye's shoulder stiff today. River running low. Others ended after only a few lines. On the desk sat a small digital recorder. Miles pressed the power button. Most files contained numbers, dates, measurements. Elias's voice listing gate positions and water levels. The later recordings were harder to hear. Wind pressed against the microphone. Elias breathed heavily between phrases. Miles increased the volume, but the ringing rose with it. In one file, Elias's words came in fragments. Rye knows the route. A long scrape. North wall. Coughing. Not only Cade. Then silence so long, Miles thought the recording had ended. Elias spoke once more. Don't open it all. Miles replayed the sentence. Then again. On the floor beside him, Rye lifted his head. Miles looked at the old dog, at the maps marked in pencil, at the invoices showing a ranch slowly starved of water. He had assumed Elias wanted the diversion reversed, but a dying man had left a different instruction. Not restore everything. Not take it all back. Don't open it all. Miles sat in his grandfather's chair while snow settled against the dark window. For the first time since returning, he understood that whatever had happened to the ranch could not be divided neatly into theft and innocence. Elias had been trying to stop Preston Cade, but he had also been trying to protect something from Miles. The Custer County Water Office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had once been a feed store. The stairs creaked beneath Miles's boots. A faded photograph of the Salmon River hung crooked beside the landing, showing water broad and silver beneath summer cottonwoods. Someone had written a date in the corner, 1957, back when the river still looked too large to be argued over. Upstairs, maps covered more wall space than windows. Delphine Ruiz stood at a long table with 3 sharpened pencils laid beside her right hand, red, blue, and violet. She was 52, tall and spare, with dark hair streaked heavily with silver at the temples and tied low at the nape of her neck. Square reading glasses rested near the end of her nose. She did not offer Miles coffee. That told him more about her than a warm welcome would have. Nora sat near the radiator, holding a paper cup from her store. Rye lay at her feet in his new olive collar, watching the room without interest in the paperwork that governed the river outside. Delphine unrolled a linen-backed map. Before we discuss what was taken, she said, you need to understand what you own. Miles stood opposite her. I own the Corbin right. You inherited a senior appropriation dated 1908. That sounds like the same thing. It isn't. Delphine picked up the blue pencil and traced a line from the upper valley through the Corbin acreage. The mark split, curved through neighboring properties, crossed pasture land, and eventually returned to the Salmon River. Water rights here are not a bucket with your name painted on it. They are a legal permission to divert a certain amount, for a recognized purpose, at a recognized point, during a recognized season. She tapped one branch of the map. The Corbin ditch feeds your north pasture first. Then overflow reaches Weller land, 2 smaller holdings, and the lower meadow system. Some of it returns to the river. Miles looked at the tangled lines. And if I restore the full amount on the old certificate? Then you may have the paper right to do it. Delphine lifted her gaze. That does not mean the valley survives it. Nora shifted in her chair but said nothing. Delphine moved the violet pencil toward the southern edge of the map, where several smaller marks had been boxed together. Preston Cade has been purchasing partial rights from distressed owners. Individually, they do not provide enough reliable volume for the development he represents. Combined with the Corbin right, they do. The resort? Private lodges, artificial ponds, snowmaking support, year-round domestic supply. Water would still be used in the valley. Delphine shook her head. The proposed pipeline crosses the low divide. Most of that water would leave this drainage and would not return to the salmon system. Miles looked again at the map. He had spent much of his life measuring danger by distance, speed, angle, and force. The violence here was slower. A line moved across paper, and 10 miles away, pasture turned brown. Delphine opened a folder. Your grandfather was not simply fighting Cade. She removed a one-page agreement and slid it toward him. Miles recognized Elias's signature at once. The sharp first stroke of the E, the slight backward lean in Corbin, a hand that had signed feed checks, birthday cards, and one permission slip after Miles broke a school window at 14. The agreement authorized a temporary reduction in Corbin irrigation volume during the previous summer. Miles stared at it. This is forged. No. You're sure? I watched him sign it. The answer came without defensiveness. Miles looked up. Delphine took off her glasses. He sat in that chair. He complained about the stairs. He asked me twice whether the reduction would end on September 15th. I told him it would. Why would he agree to starve his own ground? He did not agree to starve anything. Then what do you call a dry pasture and dead sheep? Consequences, Delphine said, not necessarily intent. Miles felt the old pressure gather behind his eyes. Rye raised his head. Nora leaned forward. What was the reduction for? Delphine rolled up the map halfway. For that you should speak to Miriam Holt. They found Miriam 2 miles east of town, beside a narrow reach of the Salmon River, where dark water moved between shelves of white ice. She stood knee-deep in snow near a metal gauge, holding a steel thermometer on a cord. At 64, Miriam Holt was small and quick in her movements, with short silver hair that refused to lie flat beneath her teal parka hood. Round red-brown glasses magnified pale blue eyes that seemed permanently alert. She glanced at Miles, then at Rye. So Elias's soldier finally came home. Miles disliked the phrase. Rye did not seem to care. Miriam reeled in the thermometer and wiped it on her glove. Your grandfather said you'd hate me. That sounds like him. He also said you'd assume he'd lost his mind. That sounds like me? A faint smile crossed her face. Good, Miles thought. At least no one here was pretending. Miriam led them along the bank to where a side channel returned beneath overhanging willows. Last August, water temperature here climbed above what young Chinook could tolerate for long stretches, she said. Low volume, hot air, shallow reach. Bad combination. She explained without lecturing. The young salmon needed cold, oxygen-rich flow. When the irrigation system pulled too much water from the upper channels, the returning water came back warmer. A dormant bypass on Corbin land had once carried a colder return flow beneath shaded ground before reconnecting with the river. Elias reopened that branch, Miriam said. Miles stopped. He altered the system himself? He cleared debris and restored an existing gate. He did not build a new diversion. Did he have permission? Miriam removed her glasses and polished them on the edge of her scarf. He had an emergency conservation request in process. That means no. It means not yet. Miles looked at the river. So he broke the rules. Yes? Miriam put her glasses back on, and he kept thousands of juvenile salmon from being trapped in warm backwater. The wind moved over the river, lifting powder snow across the ice. Miles had wanted a cleaner answer, a forged signature, a greedy broker, a wronged old man. Instead, Elias had stepped outside the law because he believed time mattered more than procedure. Nora spoke quietly. Did he know what it would cost the ranch? He expected a controlled reduction, Miriam said. Not a collapse. That distinction kept them moving. By early afternoon, Delphine had joined them with inspection keys and 2 county field binders. Together, they followed the old return channel north across Corbin land. The snow was deep enough to slow Rye, but he refused to stay behind. Miles shortened the distance and watched the dog's gait. 3 even steps, 1 shortened. When the slope steepened, Miles gave the hand signal to stop. Rye obeyed, but only until Miles moved again. Nora noticed. He's arguing politely. He learned from Elias. That explains a lot. The line almost became humor. Almost. They reached the first measurement post. Rye paused, sniffed the base, and pressed his muzzle briefly against the weathered wood. Miriam looked at him. Elias took readings here every morning. At the second post, Rye did the same. At the third, he stood for several seconds, staring toward a low mound half buried in snow. The structure looked like part of the embankment until Delphine brushed away ice from a steel hatch. "This is the access chamber," she said. The lock had been replaced. Her expression tightened. "County equipment?" "Private branch," Delphine replied. "But its flow affects the shared system." She checked the serial number against her binder. Preston's company reported this branch inactive after the spring slide. Miriam looked at the channel beneath their feet. It wasn't inactive. No? Delphine opened the hatch with a master key. Cold metallic air rose from below. Miles went down first. The chamber was narrow, lined with concrete and rusted brackets. A steel gate controlled the old bypass, but a newer plate had been welded inside the mechanism, preventing it from opening beyond a small fraction. He ran a gloved hand along the bead, recent enough to remain bright beneath the surface rust. Nora descended behind him. "So Elias agreed to reduce flow," she said, "and someone made the reduction permanent." "Not permanent," Delphine said from above. "Hidden." Miles looked at the gate. The agreement Elias had signed authorized a temporary adjustment. This plate had held the system nearly closed well beyond the date, not an invention, an extension. That made Preston's method more dangerous. He did not need to create a lie from nothing. He only needed to stretch a truth until it broke someone else. Delphine climbed down and inspected the actuator. "I requested an internal inspection in September," she said. Miles looked at her. "What happened?" "The request was delayed." "By whom?" "Deputy Director's Office. They cited unstable ground, staffing limits, pending development review." "Preston's people." "Not directly." "That is not an answer." "No," she said. "It is the answer people use when they want responsibility to dissolve into procedure." Her voice remained steady, but she did not meet his eyes. "You knew something was wrong." "I suspected." "And you let it sit." "I documented the request." "You let it sit." Delphine finally looked at him. "Yes." The word filled the chamber. No excuse followed. She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I thought the safest path was to keep the objection alive inside the system. I told myself that if I pushed too hard and lost my position, no one would be left to watch the files." "Did that help Elias?" "No." The answer was immediate. Miles had expected defense. What he received was guilt stripped of performance. For a moment, his anger had nowhere easy to land. Above them, Rye barked once. Not alarm, impatience. When Miles climbed out, Rye was scratching at the base of a leaning measurement post several yards away. Miles almost called him off. Then he saw something pale beneath the loosened snow. He knelt and reached into the frozen grass. His fingers closed around metal. A small brass whistle lay packed with ice and dirt. The leather loop had broken, but the body was intact. One side bore a shallow dent. Miles knew it. Elias had carried the whistle on a cord beneath his coat whenever he worked the upper fields. 1 short note for attention, 2 for return, 3 if weather or livestock had turned dangerous. Miles wiped the mouthpiece with his thumb. Rye pressed close and touched his nose to the whistle. The dog's whole body changed. Not fear, recognition. Miles closed his hand around it. Nora watched him carefully. "He remembers." Miles did not answer. The object was small enough to disappear in his fist, yet it seemed to hold the shape of a final morning. Amos arrived near sunset after Nora called him from the truck. He stood beside the post and turned the whistle over in his cracked hands. "Elias lost this the day he went down," he said. Miles looked toward the northern wall. "Here? Near enough." He caught one of Cade's contractors at the chamber. There was shouting. By the time I got here, Elias was on one knee beside the wall, trying to breathe. "Who was the contractor?" Amos shook his head. "Didn't know him. Heavy man. Work jacket with reflective strips. Left before the ambulance came." "And Rye?" "Wouldn't leave Elias." Amos handed back the whistle. "Paramedics loaded your grandfather. Rye tried to climb into the ambulance. They shut the door. He ran beside it as far as the county road." Miles looked at Rye. The old dog stood facing the wall. "What happened after?" "He came back here." "Why didn't anyone bring him to the house?" "We did, every day for a week. He ate there, slept there sometimes." Then by morning he was back at the wall. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge. Blue shadow filled the fields, and the first cold stars appeared above the peaks. Miles understood then that Rye had not remained because he knew about welded steel, altered flow, or forged claims. He knew only the last command written into his body. Watch this place. Elias had left in an ambulance. No one had returned to release the dog. Miles opened his hand and looked at the whistle. He could have blown it. 1 short note. 2 for return. But the ringing in his ears made the silence feel too fragile, and something in Rye's posture told him the sound belonged to another man. Instead, Miles raised his hand. Palm open, then lowered it slowly. Release. The signal had once ended long hours of work. Rye looked at him. For several seconds he did not move. Then he stepped away from the wall. Only 1 pace. But it was the first one no one had asked him to take in months. Miles knelt and rested a hand against the side of Rye's neck. The dog leaned into him, not as a soldier receiving praise, but as an old creature finally uncertain what came after duty. Behind them, the hidden gate remained welded nearly shut. Ahead, the channel disappeared beneath snow toward the river. Elias had tried to protect fish, pasture, and family with one failing body and too little time. Preston had taken that compromise and turned it into leverage. Delphine gathered her binders. "I can prove the inspection was delayed," she said. "I cannot yet prove who ordered the weld." Miles slipped the whistle into his jacket pocket. "Then we start with what can be proved." He looked once more at the gate. His grandfather had not asked him to open everything. Now Miles knew why. Because the water leaving Corbin land was not simply being taken from his family. Some of it had been given, and some had been stolen from the gift. By the end of the week, Elias Corbin had become 2 different men. At the cafe near the county courthouse, ranchers spoke of him as a stubborn old fool who had traded pasture for fish. At the conservation office, a photograph of Elias beside the Salmon River appeared on a bulletin board beneath the words, "Local stewardship matters." Neither version would have recognized him. Miles knew that because neither one included the man who reused coffee grounds, cursed at loose hinges, hid cough drops in every coat pocket, and once drove 20 miles back to town because he suspected the feed clerk had given him $6 too much change. Public arguments did not preserve people. They sharpened them into tools. The first town meeting took place on a Thursday evening in the Chalice Crossing Grange Hall. Folding chairs filled the room. Wet coats steamed near the entrance. Ranchers sat in one cluster, conservation volunteers in another, and everyone else arranged themselves according to who they feared might see them listening. Miles stood near the back wall with Nora and Delphine. Rye had remained at the ranch with Helen's instructions, a warm blanket, and strict limits on walking. Miles had nearly brought him anyway. The impulse embarrassed him. Rye had spent months holding a position for other people. He did not need to be displayed now as proof that Miles had a heart. At the front of the room, Preston Cade advanced through a polished presentation. He was 49, lean, clean-shaven, and dressed in a charcoal coat cut too well for the folding chair behind him. His dark hair was brushed neatly back, silver visible only at the temples. He spoke in a measured voice that never seemed to hurry, even when people interrupted. Behind him, a projection showed cedar lodges under soft snow, families skating beneath string lights, and a row of figures promising jobs, tax revenue, road improvement, and year-round economic stability. No image showed a dry ditch. "Water is already leaving working agriculture," Preston said. "The question is whether we continue losing value through inefficiency or redirect it toward a sustainable economic base." Amos Weller rose without waiting to be recognized. "You mean whether you get rich before the rest of us go broke?" A murmur moved through the room. Preston did not flinch. "I mean the valley cannot preserve every historical use simply because it is historical." His eyes found Miles near the wall. And Mr. Corbin's own grandfather appeared to understand that. Several heads turned. Miles felt the room reorganize around him. Preston clicked to the next slide. A scanned document appeared, Elias's signature enlarged at the bottom. The temporary reduction agreement. A rancher 2 rows ahead muttered, "There it is." Someone else said, "He signed it." Miles could have explained that the agreement covered only one season. He could have said the welded plate had extended the reduction. He could have told them the investigation was incomplete. Instead, he saw the way Preston had framed the page. No dates large enough to read, no operational limits. Only Elias's signature made visible from across the hall. A dead man reduced to ink. Miles stepped away from the wall. "He signed a temporary reduction," he said. His voice carried less easily than Preston's. The ringing was sharp tonight, fed by chair legs scraping, coughs, whispers, and the old heater knocking in the corner. Preston folded his hands. "Of course, and temporary measures often reveal permanent realities. The permanent reality is that someone welded the gate nearly shut. We do not yet know who. You reported the branch inactive, based on information provided by contractors." Amos swore under his breath. Preston's gaze remained on Miles. "I understand this is personal. You have returned during a difficult transition." The phrase irritated Miles more than an insult would have. Returned during a difficult transition, as if he had arrived late to a committee meeting. "I returned to a ranch that lost water under an agreement my grandfather never signed." Preston's expression changed only slightly. "There are multiple documents." "Exactly." For the first time, the room quieted for Miles rather than around him. He looked at the projected signature, then at the people studying him as if grief had appointed him spokesman for Elias. "I don't yet know everything my grandfather did," Miles said. "Neither do you." That was not the declaration the ranchers wanted. They wanted him to call Elias innocent. The conservation group wanted him to call Elias brave. Miles gave them neither. "I know one agreement was real. I know another may not be. Until the records are separated, no one gets to use his name as a flag." Preston smiled faintly. "A reasonable position." The smile made it sound like defeat. After the meeting, Delphine led Miles and Nora through the courthouse annex to a records room with green metal cabinets and a long fluorescent light that hummed almost in tune with the ringing in Miles's ears. 3 document boxes waited on the table. Delphine opened the first. "Original temporary reduction," she said, "signed by Elias in my presence, effective June 1st through September 15th. She opened the second. "Amended operational appendix. The end date was changed to November 30th. The diversion volume was increased." Nora leaned closer. "Same signature?" "Copied from the first page." Delphine pointed to the slight blurring around the ink. The image was inserted electronically, then printed. The third file contained an application to permanently transfer a large portion of the Corbin right to North Range Holdings, a company Miles had not heard of. Delphine tapped the ownership line. "North Range is controlled by a development entity connected to Preston." Miles studied the signature at the bottom. It looked like Elias's. Almost. The first stroke was correct. The backward lean was there, but the final N in Corbin rose too high. Elias had broken the middle finger of his right hand in a shoot accident at 32. After that, his last letters always flattened slightly. Miles touched the page. "He didn't sign this." "I agree," Delphine said, "but agreement is not proof." A notary seal appeared beside the signature. "Harold Venn, Custer County." Delphine closed the file. "He retired 18 months before the date on this document." They found Harold Venn the next morning in a small house behind the Methodist church, where he repaired antique radios for people who no longer needed them but could not bear to throw them away. Harold was 67, narrow in the shoulders, with white hair combed straight back and magnifying lenses clipped over his glasses. He wore a rust-colored cardigan and had the dry, precise hands of a man who had spent decades aligning paper edges. He examined the seal under a desk lamp. "That is my commission number." "Could someone have used an old stamp?" Nora asked. Harold's mouth tightened. "My stamp was surrendered when I retired." "To whom?" "The county clerk." He turned the document sideways. "But this impression is too clean." Miles waited. Harold pointed to the border around the seal. "The replacement stamp I used during my last year had a chipped lower edge. This is from the earlier die." "Where is that one?" Harold sat back. "It should have been destroyed." Silence settled among the radios. Then Harold removed the magnifying lenses. "Preston Cade visited me 2 years ago, asked whether I still kept my old notary journals and obsolete equipment." "Why?" Miles asked. "Said his company was funding a local archival exhibit, old land records, historic instruments, heritage branding." Nora gave a humorless laugh. "Legacy in a glass case. I told him the journals were not for sale." "The stamp?" "I told him it had been surrendered." Harold looked again at the page. "I cannot prove he obtained it. But you recognize the seal. I recognize something that should not exist." It was the strongest evidence they had found, and still not enough. The documents established a pattern, a real agreement, an altered appendix, a forged transfer. They did not connect Preston directly to the welded gate, the contractor, or the manipulation of field data. Truth had begun to form. It simply had not learned how to stand in court. That afternoon, Miles returned to Bellwether Mercantile with Nora. The store smelled of coffee, canvas, pine cleaner, and onions stored in wooden crates. Handwritten account cards filled a drawer beneath the register. A brass bell hung near Nora's key ring, chiming softly whenever she crossed behind the counter. Miles had come to ask whether she remembered the survey trucks. Instead, he found an envelope on the desk in the back office. Nora had left it partly beneath a stack of invoices. The visible corner carried the name North Range Capital. Miles stopped. He did not open it. He did not need to. The same company appeared on the forged transfer. Nora came through the doorway carrying 2 mugs. She saw where he was looking. The change in her face gave him the answer before she spoke. "How much?" he asked. She set the mugs down carefully. "Miles? How much do you owe them?" Her shoulders went still beneath the dark olive apron. 48,000. The figure landed without sound. For the store? For repairs, inventory, and the winter after the highway closure. And if you default? Nora looked at the envelope. They have an option on the building and warehouse. Miles felt something harden in him. You knew North Range was tied to Preston. I knew after I took the loan. How long after? 3 months. And you said nothing. I told you the store was in debt. You did not tell me Preston held the rope. Nora's eyes sharpened. I told you enough to make myself look compromised. Apparently not enough to satisfy your preferred version of betrayal. You wanted me to stay and fight him. Yes? To protect your store. To protect more than my store? But your store first. Her face changed then, not into guilt, but anger. You think people only get to do the right thing if they have nothing to gain? That is not what I said. It is exactly what you are saying. Miles looked toward the front of the shop, where winter light rested across sacks of flour and sheep mineral blocks. You brought food to Rye. You helped me with the gate. You stood beside me at the meeting, all while knowing your lender was the same company trying to take the water. Yes? And you never thought that mattered? I thought you would decide everything I did was a strategy. Wasn't it? Nora stared at him. Then she untied the apron and folded it once over the back of a chair. You know what your problem is? Miles almost laughed. Choose one. You think suspicion is the same thing as judgment. I have reasons to be suspicious. So did Rye. The use of the dog's name stopped him. Nora stepped closer. Rye spent months guarding a wall because someone gave him a duty and never came back. You look at him and see loyalty. Her voice remained low. But maybe you also see evidence that you are still the man who deserves that loyalty. Miles said nothing. Nora continued. You feed him. You sit beside him. You use the old hand signals. And part of you thinks if he forgives you, then 7 years disappear. The words found the place he had protected most carefully. That's enough. No, you accused me of using you. You did. And you are using Rye. Miles' hands closed at his sides. Do not tell me what I feel about that dog. I'm telling you what you are asking him to carry. The room went quiet except for the refrigerator compressor behind the wall. Nora's eyes shone, but she did not cry. I helped Rye because he was hungry. I hoped you would fight Preston because I am scared. Both can be true. She picked up her coat. You keep looking for one clean motive in every person. You won't find it. Not in Elias, not in me, not in yourself. She walked past him. The bell on her keys gave one small note. Miles did not follow. By the time he returned to the ranch, snow had begun falling in dry, fine grains. Rye stood near the porch in his charcoal winter coat. Helen had said limited movement, but the dog had apparently persuaded himself that the distance between the kitchen and the steps did not count. Miles opened the truck door. Rye looked past him, waiting for Nora. She isn't coming, Miles said. The dog's ears shifted. Miles went inside. Rye remained near the porch for several minutes, then moved toward the path where Nora usually parked. His nose lowered. He found something half buried in the fresh snow, a gray wool glove. Nora must have dropped it when she left the ranch that morning before they went to Harold's house. Rye picked it up. Miles expected him to carry it toward the road or hold it between his teeth with the restless urgency of a working dog seeking direction. Instead, Rye walked back to Miles and placed the glove on his boot. Then he sat. No command, no demand, only the returned possession of someone absent. Miles looked down at the glove. Rye hadn't followed Nora. He had not asked Miles to follow. He had simply refused to let what belonged to her disappear beneath the snow. That night, Miles replayed Elias's recordings. He began with the earliest files, not the final one. Most contained figures, dates, gate positions, temperatures, ditch depths. Elias spoke in the clipped rhythm of a man recording facts before his hands forgot how to write them. Near midnight, Miles found a file labeled August 28th North. Wind crowded the microphone. Elias coughed, then spoke. Electronic meter is wrong again, running lower than report. I'm writing the true flow by hand every morning. A pause. Old gauge station, steel box below the west shelf. Another cough. Rye is to alert on vehicles past the north wall. Men were here before daylight. Miles leaned closer. The ringing distorted the next sentence. He replayed it with one ear covered. Silas says not to trust the uploads. Silas Fenn, Elias's oldest friend, former ditch maintenance foreman. A man Miles had not seen since childhood, when Silas had taught him to tie a knot that held under tension, but released with one pull. Miles called Delphine. Nora arrived the next morning, not because either of them had repaired the argument, but because Delphine had contacted her first. She stood beside the truck wearing a different pair of gloves and did not ask whether Miles had found the missing one. He had placed it on the dashboard. The three of them crossed the middle field toward the old gauge station. Rye remained at the house under Helen's restrictions, watching from the kitchen window. The station was little more than a low concrete shelter sunk into the bank. Snow had drifted over the west side. Delphine found the steel box beneath a ledge. The latch hung open. Inside lay only a rectangle of clean metal where a notebook had once rested. Nora crouched near the entrance. Someone was here after the last snow. A pair of narrow tire tracks crossed the field from the service road. Nearby, boot prints led to the station. The tread was worn smooth at the outer heels. Miles found a short piece of utility cord snagged on the hatch. One end had been tied with an old maintenance hitch. 2 turns, a crossing loop, and a quick-release tail. He knew the knot. Silas had taught it to him beside this same ditch 30 years earlier. Nora stood slowly. I saw his truck. Miles looked at her. When? The morning Elias went to the hospital, blue and silver pickup, parked near the gauge road. Why didn't you mention it? I didn't know it mattered. The answer carried no defense this time, only fatigue. Delphine photographed the tracks and the knot. Silas had access to these stations for decades, she said. He would know where Elias kept records. Miles looked into the empty box. Preston might have wanted the notebook destroyed. Silas might have wanted it protected. Either possibility could begin with the same missing object. Snow sifted into the open station and settled across the clean metal rectangle. Miles picked up the cord. Silas Fenn had reached the truth before all of them. The question was whether he had hidden it from Preston or from Miles. Silas Fenn lived above the valley where the snow held longer and the road narrowed into 2 white ruts between stands of pine. His house stood on a south-facing slope built from pale logs darkened around the windows by age. Sunlight struck the roof and broke into silver along the eaves. A row of handmade weather vanes turned slowly above the shed, each shaped like a trout, a heron, or a narrow wooden boat. Miles parked beside a blue and silver pickup, the same colors Nora remembered. Rye sat in the passenger seat wearing his charcoal winter coat. Helen had allowed one short outing if Miles kept the dog warm and avoided deep snow. Nora remained at the ranch, helping Amos inventory the remaining feed. The distance between her and Miles had not healed, but it had become quieter. Sometimes quiet was not peace. Sometimes it was simply a truce, too tired to argue. Miles stepped onto the porch and knocked. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then 3 locks turned. Silas opened the door only wide enough to see through. At 71, he had the narrow frame of a man whose work had stripped away everything not needed. His silver hair reached past his ears and was combed straight back. Heavy white eyebrows crowded a long face with hollow cheeks and a hooked nose. A thin mustache rested above his upper lip, precise in a way the rest of him was not. He wore a faded blue work shirt beneath a brown wool vest. One finger on his left hand bent inward at the first joint. His eyes moved from Miles to Rye. The locks no longer seemed necessary. "You brought him." "He came." Silas looked at Rye for several seconds. "Elias used to say the same thing." He opened the door. The house was warmer than Miles expected. Clocks covered one wall, none showing the same time. Brass pressure gauges sat on shelves beside glass jars of bolts, copper wire, and water-worn stones. On the windowsill rested 6 small fishing boats carved from cedar, each detailed down to the rope coils on deck. The clocks ticked without agreement. For Miles, the sound merged with the ringing until the room felt crowded by invisible insects. Silas noticed the slight tilt of his head. "You still hear the whistle?" Miles looked at him. "Elias told you." "He told me enough." Silas moved toward a wood stove. "Coffee?" "No." "Good. Mine tastes like roofing tar." Rye entered slowly and stopped near the center of the room. Silas did not touch him. He sat at a workbench and folded his hands. "You found the station?" "Yes." "And the knot?" "Yes." Silas nodded once. "I took the book." There was no hesitation, no attempt to protect himself with confusion. Miles remained standing. "Where is it?" "Safe." "That is not a place?" "It is when people know less than they think they do." Miles set the short length of utility cord on the bench. "You took evidence from a county gauge station." Silas looked at the cord. "I took Elias's notebook from a steel box no one had checked in months." "You had no right." "No." The admission came so easily that Miles lost the first edge of his anger. Silas leaned back. "I reported the false readings in July, then again in August. Flow at the channel was lower than the uploaded numbers. Gate positions did not match the logs." "To Delphine?" "To the county, the regional office, and one state engineer who stopped returning calls." "What happened?" "Preston's attorney sent me a letter. Defamation, interference with development, economic damages." Silas gave a dry smile. Very impressive language for telling an old ditch man to shut his mouth. "And you did?" "For a while." The clocks continued ticking. Silas looked toward the window. "My report disappeared from the active file. Delphine found a reference to it later, but the measurements were gone. When Elias died, I knew the notebook would be next." "So you took it?" "I protected it." "From whom?" Silas's eyes returned to Miles. "Everyone." The word settled between them. Miles understood some of the old man's distrust. He did not accept it. "You knew I was back." "I heard. You could have contacted me." Silas's mouth tightened. "You came home after Elias was in the ground." Miles felt the accusation before Silas finished speaking. "You think a uniform, a damaged ear, and a dead man's deed make you the right person to decide what happens now?" "I didn't say they did." "No, you just walked in asking for the book." Rye shifted near the stove. Miles kept his voice level. "What did Elias want?" Silas laughed once without humor. "He wanted 5 things that could not all exist together. He wanted the sheep watered. He wanted the salmon alive. He wanted Cade exposed. He wanted the valley to stop selling itself one desperate acre at a time. Silas leaned forward. And he wanted you to come home before he had to ask. That last sentence was not necessary, which was why it was true. Miles looked away. On a shelf behind Silas sat a small brass clock with no hands. "Show me the book." Silas studied him. Then he rose. The wall panel beside the stove opened when he pressed a hidden latch. Inside lay a wrapped bundle secured with waxed canvas. Silas carried it to the table and unfolded the cloth. The notebook was larger than Miles expected. A black field ledger with water stains along the bottom edge, its spine reinforced with gray tape. Elias's handwriting filled every page. Dates, temperatures, gate positions, measured flow, vehicle descriptions, license plate fragments, names of contractors. Notes in the margins grew shakier toward the end, but the numbers remained careful. Silas turned to a marked page. August 12th. Elias had recorded a gate setting of 30%. The uploaded county report showed 55. August 20th. Chathya, the handwritten reading again showed less water than the official file. On another page, Elias had written, "White contractor truck, North Range, logo removed, 5:40 a.m. Below it, gate altered after inspection. Rye alerted before engine heard." Miles read in silence. The notebook did not prove every order came from Preston, but it mapped a pattern no reasonable investigator could dismiss. Silas turned several pages. Here is the part you will not like. The entry described Elias opening the old return branch 6 days before his emergency conservation request was approved. He had done it twice more. The third entry included Miriam Holt's initials. Miles looked up. She knew? She knew after the first opening, told him to stop until the paperwork cleared. But he didn't. No? Silas placed one finger on the page. If this book goes in whole, Cade's people will use these entries against Elias. They will say he manipulated the system first. They will challenge the Corbin right. Maybe win a partial cancellation. And if the pages disappear? Preston falls cleaner. Miles understood the offer before Silas made it. Silas reached toward the stove. Its door glowed orange around the edges. 6 pages, he said. That is all. Miles stared at him. You want to burn them. I want to protect a good man from a mistake made for the right reason. A mistake that changed other people's water. He saved fish and risked farms. He was trying to save both. He failed. Silas's face hardened. You think saying that makes you brave? No. Then what does it make you? Miles looked down at Elias's handwriting. Honest. Silas stood so abruptly, the chair scraped backward. Honest? The clock seemed louder. You left him here. I watched him climb that north ditch with one hand on his chest because you were too busy being broken somewhere else. Miles did not move. Silas struck the table with his bent hand. And now you come back wanting clean truth, because clean truth hurts less than guilt. The accusation found its target. Miles could have answered with the explosion, the hospitals, the nights he woke, convinced alarms were sounding when the room was silent. He did not. Those things were true. They were also not an answer. Silas pointed toward the notebook. You will sacrifice his name so you can tell yourself you finally did the hard thing. Miles met his eyes. No. Then burn the pages. No. The word was quiet. Silas stared at him. Miles placed both hands on the table. I spent years watching reports get rewritten until mistakes became accidents, and accidents became no one's fault. Men called that protecting the mission. He looked at the stove. It protected reputations. His voice lowered. It did not protect the dead. Silas's anger faltered, but did not disappear. If I remove Elias's part, then every decision afterward is built on the same silence that brought us here. He deserves better. He deserves the truth. Dead men cannot defend themselves. Then we tell it accurately. Silas stepped closer. Accurately? Yes, he acted before approval. Preston exploited it. Both things happened. And if the Corbin right is reduced, then it is reduced. Silas looked at him as if he had spoken blasphemy. You would give away what Elias fought to keep. I will not keep it by lying about what he did. The room held still. Then Rye rose. The old dog crossed the rug slowly, 3 even steps, and 1 shortened. He stopped beside Silas and lowered his head onto the man's knee. Silas froze. His hand hovered over Rye's neck. For several seconds he did not touch him. Then his fingers came down. The first movement was careful. The second was not. Silas bent forward as though something inside him had given way. I left, he said. Miles heard the words clearly. Silas's hand tightened in Rye's fur. We fought at the gate. Elias said the salmon would die if he waited. I told him the county would crucify him if he touched it. His voice broke. I called him an old fool. Rye remained still. I said he cared more about proving himself right than keeping the ranch alive. He told me I was afraid of Preston. Silas swallowed. He was right. The clocks continued their separate measures of time. I left him there, Silas whispered. 3 days later, he went down by the wall. Miles looked at the old man and understood why the notebook had been hidden. Silas was not only protecting Elias, he was preserving the last argument between them, frozen in a form where he could still choose a different ending. I thought Rye was waiting for Elias, Silas said. Miles looked at the dog. Maybe he was waiting for both of us. Silas closed his eyes. When he opened them, he drew the notebook toward Miles. Take it. Miles did not reach immediately. One condition. What? Do not turn Elias into a saint. Shut. Silas looked toward the window. He was proud, secretive. He made decisions for other people because he trusted his own judgment too much. A weak smile touched his mouth. He was also the best man I knew. Miles placed a hand on the notebook. I can live with both. Silas released it. By late afternoon, Miles stood in Delphine's office with the ledger open beside the 3 document files. Nora was there. She wore her green work shirt beneath a camel-colored coat. The missing gray glove lay on the table between them. Neither mentioned it. Delphine read in silence for nearly an hour. When she finished, she removed her glasses. This is enough to reopen the state review, she said. It may also trigger an inquiry into Elias's unauthorized operations. I know. And a challenge to your full allocation. I know. Nora studied Miles. What do you want to ask for? The question surprised him. Until then, everyone had asked what he intended to recover. Miles moved toward the wall map. He traced the Corbin ditch, the lower farms, and the return branch to the salmon. Not the maximum? Delphine frowned. Explain. Miles did. A 3-year interim agreement. Enough guaranteed irrigation to support a smaller Corbin flock and stabilize the north pasture. A protected return flow during dangerous summer temperatures. Public weekly measurements from the gauge station. Oversight by landowners, hydrology staff, and a town representative. No permanent transfer outside the drainage while the pilot remained active. Delphine listened without interrupting. This would need county approval, state review, and consent from affected users. I know. It could take months. Then it takes months. Nora looked at the figures. Can the ranch survive on that amount? Not at its old size. And you are willing to accept that? Miles thought of the empty hayloft, the welded gate. Elias walking a line between two losses and believing he could carry both alone. Yes. Amos did not share the answer. When Delphine called him to the office, he read the proposal standing up. By the second page, the repaired seam on his cap had gone red beneath the pressure of his fingers. You are giving it away. I'm setting limits. You have the oldest right in the system. And Cade counted on everyone defending their private piece until he could buy the pieces one at a time. Amos threw the document onto the table. Your grandfather bled for that water. He also sent some of it back to the river. Without permission. Yes? Amos stared at him. You think admitting that makes the sheep drink? No. Then what good is it? Miles answered carefully. It stops us building the next agreement on a lie. Nora spoke from near the window. And if the minimum is too low, we adjust after review. If the ranch fails before then? Miles looked at her. Then the plan failed. The plainness of the answer unsettled everyone. Nora crossed her arms. You could lose the ranch. I could lose it fighting for all the water, too. He looked at Amos. And if every ranch holds out alone, Preston waits until the weakest one sells. Amos's face remained hard. Miles continued. The old system is not protecting us. It is only deciding the order in which we disappear. No one answered. Outside, evening light turned the courthouse windows gold. The valley beyond them lay bright beneath snow, beautiful enough to look permanent. Miles knew better now. Nothing survived because it had always existed. It survived because someone chose what could change before everything was taken. On the table, Elias's notebook remained open. The truth inside it was not clean. Neither was the proposal Miles placed beside it, but both were whole. The storm reached Sawtooth Valley before sunset. It came over the western ridge in a wall of white, swallowing the last blue strip of sky and flattening the mountains into shadow. By 4 o'clock, snow moved sideways across the Corbin fields. Fence posts disappeared one by one. The barn became a dark shape behind blowing ice, then vanished completely. Miles stood at the kitchen window and watched the world shorten. The county hearing was scheduled for the next morning, though no one expected the roads to remain open. Delphine had called twice before the cell signal began failing. Her concern was not the hearing, it was the gauge station. The main recorder had a backup battery, but the cold had already weakened it. If power failed during the storm, the system would lose the continuous flow record at the exact moment the state review began. Bellwether Mercantile kept the correct battery unit and inverter in stock for remote livestock wells. Nora arrived with both. Her old delivery van pushed through the snow just after 3, headlights pale in the thickening weather. She stepped out wearing her mustard puffer over a dark green hoodie, carrying a weatherproof case in both hands. Miles met her near the porch. You should have stayed in town. So should the battery? The county could have sent someone. The county sent a voicemail. She passed him the case. Their argument from the store still stood between them, not as loudly as before, but not gone. The missing glove remained on the dashboard of Miles's truck. Nora had seen it. Neither had spoken of it. They loaded the equipment into a sled and crossed the field before visibility collapsed. Rye came with them, despite Miles's first command to stay. The old German shepherd wore his charcoal winter coat and moved close to Miles's left side, where hand signals were easiest to see. His stride was slower than it had been 2 days earlier. Helen had warned that cold would stiffen the damaged shoulder and rear leg. Miles turned his palm downward. Slow. Rye obeyed. For once. At the gauge station, wind pressed against the concrete shelter hard enough to make the access hatch tremble. Nora held a lantern while Miles disconnected the failing battery. The ringing in his ears had sharpened with the drop in pressure, rising until even Nora's voice seemed to come through metal. She tapped his sleeve before speaking. "Red lead first?" He looked at her mouth, then at the cable. "Black off first, red on first." She nodded. No embarrassment, no pretending he had heard. That small adjustment mattered more than either of them acknowledged. They installed the new battery and inverter, secured the housing, and waited until the recorder's green indicator steadied. "Continuous feed," Nora said, pointing to the screen. Miles saw the words more clearly than he heard them. By the time they left the station, the service road had disappeared beneath drifting snow. At the ranch, the radio announced closures along both county routes. The sheriff's office advised everyone to remain where they were until morning. Nora stood near the kitchen stove, snow melting from her hair. "I suppose this is where you say you told me so." "I considered it. And I'm trying something new." "What?" "Not making everything worse." She looked at him, then laughed once. It was brief and tired, but real. Miles almost missed the sound. He did not miss the shape of it. Night fell early. The storm erased the windows. Wind struck the house in long, uneven blows, making the roof groan and the old pipes tick behind the walls. Nora slept in the downstairs guest room. Miles remained on the sofa near Rye, Elias's ledger, and Delphine's proposed hearing notes spread across the coffee table. He tried to read. The ringing had become a blade. Storm noise usually helped because it gave the tinnitus something to hide inside. Tonight, pressure and exhaustion made both sounds merge. He could not tell whether the scraping came from branches, loose siding, or only his own damaged hearing. Rye slept with his head on his paws. Near midnight, the dog stood. Miles did not notice at first. He was reading the same sentence for the fourth time when Rye's front paw struck the floor. Once, hard. The vibration traveled through the boards and into Miles's boot. He looked up. Rye faced the back door. His ears were high. His weight had shifted forward. The old stiffness was gone beneath the return of trained attention. Then Rye barked. Miles saw the chest move before he understood the sound. The dog looked at him, stamped again, then turned toward the door. Not fear. Alert. Miles crossed to the window and wiped condensation from the glass. At first, there was only snow. Then a light moved beyond the lower field. Not the steady wash of a vehicle on the road. A narrow beam, disappearing and returning between curtains of wind, near the gauge station. Nora came from the hallway pulling on her coat. "What is it?" Miles pointed. She saw the light. The recorder would have sent an alert if the housing opened. "Unless they cut power first." He reached for the field jacket hanging beside the stove. Nora caught his arm. "We call the sheriff." Miles held up his phone. No service. "The station has its own alarm relay," she said, "if the battery is still connected." Rye moved to the door. Miles looked at the dog's shoulder, at the thin body Helen had ordered him to protect. "No." Rye met his eyes. Miles gave the stay signal. The dog held still. Then another light flashed outside. Rye looked at the field, then back at Miles. Duty and age stood together in the same body. Miles lowered his hand. Close. Rye came to his left side. They crossed the field, using the fence line to keep direction. Nora carried a coiled utility rope and the lantern under her coat. Snow struck their faces like sand. Miles could see only 20 feet ahead. The lights near the station became two figures. One was broad, wearing a construction jacket with reflective strips. The other stood in a dark graphite parka too clean for work. Preston Cade. The larger man had already opened the access hatch. He was Cal Danner, 44, former site foreman for North Range. His thick neck disappeared into a gray hoodie, and a pale ginger beard rimmed his jaw. One gloved hand held a red multi-purpose tool, The other gripped a small black data unit. Preston held a metal case. "You said the money first," Cal shouted over the wind. Miles heard only fragments. Nora leaned close to his ear. "They're arguing about payment." Cal raised the data unit. "I kept copies, messages, invoices, plate order, all of it." Preston's face changed. Not much, only enough to reveal that Cal had finally become dangerous to him. "You were paid to do a job," Preston said. "I was paid to install a restriction, not take the fall for forged records." Miles stepped into the lantern light. "Put the device down." Cal turned sharply. Preston did not. He looked at Miles with a tired kind of contempt. "You have a talent for arriving after damage is done." Miles moved closer. "Walk away from the gate." Cal glanced between them. "I called Cade here to trade the recorder and copies for enough money to leave Idaho." Nora raised the rope coil. "That seems like a very poor retirement plan." Cal almost smiled. Preston did not. "You have no idea what this man has done," he said, gesturing toward Cal. "He altered infrastructure, falsified maintenance reports, tampered with county equipment." "On your orders," Cal replied. "You cannot prove that." Cal lifted the black unit. "This can." Preston moved suddenly. He struck Cal's wrist with the metal case. The data unit fell into the snow. Cal lunged after it, and Preston seized the long wrench from beside the open hatch. The movement was not wild. It was desperate calculation finally stripped of polish. Preston dropped into the access chamber. Cal swore. "He's going for the main gate." Miles followed to the edge. Below, Preston forced the wrench onto the release assembly. "What happens if he opens it?" Nora asked. Cal stared into the chamber. Not slowly, the whole plate shifts. Ice pressure hits the lower wall. Miles looked at him. "Damage?" "Enough to blow out the bank." "And the data?" "Looks like storm failure." Preston pulled at the wrench. Metal screamed. Miles did not hear it. He saw Cal flinch, saw Nora turn toward the sound, saw Rye's ears flatten. Then Rye slammed into Miles's leg. Miles fell sideways. A steel brace broke free from above the hatch and crashed where his shoulder had been. The edge struck Rye instead. The dog went down hard in the snow. "Rye!" Miles crawled to him. Rye lay on his side, breathing fast. His right shoulder had taken the blow. One foreleg folded awkwardly beneath him. Miles put a hand near the joint. Rye snapped once at the air, not at Miles, but at pain. "Easy." Miles raised 2 fingers. Rye found his face, held. Then the gate released. Water surged beneath the ice with a deep vibration Miles felt through the ground. Preston climbed out of the chamber and ran toward the lower bank. The snow beneath him collapsed. He dropped waist-deep into the channel. Cal moved forward, then stopped. A crack opened along the concrete wall above Preston. Rye lifted his head. He was not looking at the trapped man. He was looking at the crack. The dog barked repeatedly, body rigid despite the pain. Miles followed his gaze. The upper section of the chamber was shifting. If it fell, Preston would be buried under concrete, ice, and water. For 1 second, Miles did nothing. He saw Elias's failing ranch, Rye at the wall, the forged signature, Nora's debt. Years of damage translated into one man's body below him. It would have been easy to call the collapse inevitable. Weather, bad footing, an accident. The same language used to erase responsibility everywhere else. Miles grabbed the rope from Nora. "Anchor it to the post." She moved immediately. Cal seized the loose end. "You pull him up," Miles said. "I go down. You'll both get crushed. Then keep the line tight." Miles slid into the channel far enough to reach Preston. Preston stared up at him, face white with cold and disbelief. "You should leave me." Miles looped the rope beneath his arms. That would make this simpler. The concrete cracked again. Rye barked. Miles looked up. Nora had braced herself against the post, boots buried in snow. Cal pulled beside her. "Now!" They hauled. Preston rose from the channel as the upper wall broke loose. Miles threw himself sideways. Concrete struck the edge behind him, sending black water and ice across the snow. For several seconds, no one moved. Then a distant siren rose through the storm. The station's alarm relay had worked. Delphine arrived with 2 sheriff's deputies and a county utility crew. The emergency signal had transmitted when the recorder housing lost power and the gate moved beyond its authorized limit. Cal surrendered the data unit, his phone, and the folder of copied invoices inside his jacket. The metal case Preston brought contained cash. By dawn, Preston was in custody. Cal sat in the rear of another cruiser, wrapped in a blanket, speaking to a deputy about a cooperation agreement before anyone had offered him one. The recorder, messages, tools, payment records, and emergency gate activity tied the night together more firmly than Elias's notebook ever could alone. Miles did not watch the vehicles leave. He rode in Helen Crowder's veterinary truck with Rye. The dog's shoulder was badly bruised, but not broken. Helen wrapped it, prescribed pain medication, and warned that recovery would be slower because of his age. Back at the ranch, morning light turned the storm clouds pale. Rye lay on a blanket in the kitchen. Nora sat beside him, one hand resting near his paw without touching the injured shoulder. Miles stood at the stove. "He knew before I did," he said. "He usually does." "I didn't hear the brace break." Nora looked up. Miles touched the side of his head. "I did not come home because I was afraid Elias would see this." Nora waited. "The ringing, the way I miss words, the way rooms turn into noise. I had hearing devices fitted once, left them in the case." "Why?" "Because needing them made it real." Rye breathed slowly between them. Miles looked toward the dark window. "I wanted Elias to remember the man who left." Nora's voice was quiet. "Maybe Elias wanted you to remember the man he had been, too." Miles turned. "He hid the gate, the papers, the bad decisions." "Phew, he was afraid you would come home and see that he had failed." Miles looked at Rye. One man had hidden his damage at sea. Another had hidden his mistakes in a valley. Between them, an old dog had kept returning to the same wall because neither had been willing to release the other from memory. Nora touched Rye's paw. "You both used silence to protect your pride." Miles sat beside her. "And Rye held the position for us." Outside, snow began sliding from the roof in soft, heavy sheets. The storm had passed. For the first time, Miles did not mistake the quiet afterward for emptiness. Preston Cade was charged before the snowbanks along Main Street had finished hardening from the storm. The list of accusations sounded almost too orderly for what he had done: falsifying land and water records, unlawful use of a retired notary seal, tampering with county monitoring equipment, fraud involving senior water rights, and conspiracy to damage irrigation infrastructure. The words fit neatly on paper. The consequences had not. North Range attorneys arrived from Boise within 2 days. They issued statements about unauthorized actions by subcontractors and warned against premature conclusions. Cal Danner entered negotiations with the prosecutor and began turning over messages, invoices, work orders, and voice recordings he had kept in case Preston ever tried to bury him beneath the scheme. The permanent transfer application was suspended. The Corbin water right was restored provisionally while the state investigation continued. Provisional was not victory. It meant the law had stopped moving in the wrong direction long enough for everyone to decide where it should go next. The county hearing was rescheduled for 10 days after the storm. By then, Rye could stand without help, though Helen Crowder had wrapped his injured shoulder and forbidden him from walking farther than the porch. He objected by carrying one of Miles's gloves to the back door and placing it there with great dignity. Helen was unmoved. "You were hit by steel," she told him. Rye looked at Miles. Miles raised one hand. "Not today." Rye sighed through his nose and lowered himself onto the blanket. "You two are terrible patients," Helen said. Miles did not argue. The hearing filled the same Grange Hall where Preston had once projected pictures of heated paths and smiling visitors. This time, no polished presentation glowed at the front. Elias's black field ledger lay beneath a document camera. Every page had been copied. Nothing had been removed. Miles sat beside Delphine and listened through the small hearing devices fitted behind his ears the day before. They did not erase the ringing. They separated voices from it, imperfectly, but enough that he no longer had to guess every third sentence. He disliked the pressure of them. He disliked being seen wearing them. He wore them anyway. Across the room, Amos sat with his arms folded. Miriam Holt held a waterproof notebook on her lap. Silas Fenn occupied the last chair in the row and stared at the floor as though the building had invited him only to witness a sentence. Nora sat near the aisle. She had not taken Miles's missing glove accusation back because he had never asked her to. Neither had she accepted his first apology, which had been mostly explanation wearing a better coat. The second had been simpler. "I was wrong to make your fear evidence against you." She had nodded. That was all. When Miles's name was called, he walked to the front. The room quieted. He looked at Elias's ledger on the screen. The handwriting enlarged above him trembled in the later entries, though the figures remained precise. For several seconds, Miles said nothing. People waited for him to defend his grandfather. Others waited for him to condemn him. He had spent enough time around public arguments to understand that most audiences preferred a clean man or a guilty one. Complexity required patience, and patience rarely filled meeting halls. "My grandfather signed a lawful temporary reduction," Miles began. "He did not sign the permanent transfer." He described the altered appendix, the copied signature, the obsolete notary seal, the welded restriction, and the mismatch between measured flow and uploaded reports. Then he turned a page in the ledger. He also opened the return branch before his emergency conservation request was approved. A murmur moved across the room. Miles let it. He did that because the lower reach of the salmon was overheating and juvenile Chinook were beginning to die. A rancher near the wall called, "And our pasture was supposed to die instead?" "No," Miles said. He looked directly toward the voice. He believed he could reduce one loss without causing the other. Was he wrong? Miles thought of the empty hayloft, the sold flock, the 3 sheep Amos had buried during the August heat. Yes. The room changed, not dramatically, only enough that no faction could claim him completely. He was wrong to act without approval. He was wrong to keep decisions from people whose land depended on the same system. He was also right that the river was in danger. Miles placed one hand beside the ledger. Elias Corbin was not a traitor to ranchers. He was not a saint of conservation. He was an old man who saw 2 disasters coming from opposite directions and tried to hold both back with a failing body and a plan larger than one person could carry. Silas lifted his head. Miles continued. Preston Cade found that weakness and used it, but Preston did not create every mistake in this valley. He profited from the fact that all of us were protecting our own peace so fiercely that no one was watching what happened to the whole. This time, the silence lasted. Delphine presented the 3-year pilot proposal. The Corbin Ranch would receive a guaranteed base flow sufficient for a reduced flock and the recovery of the north pasture. During periods of dangerous river temperature, A measured return flow would remain open for the salmon reach. Gauge data would be published weekly. Changes to the gate would require dual authorization and a visible digital record. An oversight group would include Delphine, 2 participating landowners, Miriam as an ecological advisor, Silas as technical maintenance consultant, and 1 rotating town representative. No transfer outside the drainage would proceed during the pilot. The longer-term water trust proposal would only be studied. Nothing permanent would be promised before the evidence existed. Amos rose to speak against it. His repaired cap was in his hands. "I do not like giving up water we may legally claim," he said. "I do not trust state review. I do not trust temporary plans to remain temporary." He glanced at Miles. "And I especially do not trust men who have lived away for 7 years to know what keeps sheep alive." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Miles stayed seated. Amos looked down at the cap. "But I trust a dry trough less." He placed the cap back on his head. "So, I will join the pilot, not because I think it is wise, because I want to be present when it proves otherwise." It was the closest Amos came to endorsement. The pilot passed by a narrow margin. No one applauded at first. Then one person did. Miriam. A few others joined. The sound did not become celebration. It became permission to breathe. The months that followed were not heroic. They were filled with invoices, meetings, frozen bolts, veterinary schedules, rejected forms, revised forms, and one argument about whether a gate sensor could legally be installed on a private branch without a second easement. Preston's prosecution continued slowly. Cal's testimony connected the welding work, false maintenance logs, and altered uploads to instructions routed through North Range. Harold Venn helped investigators review old notarized transfers. 3 more suspicious documents surfaced. Delphine began publishing the flow data every Friday. Silas returned to the gauge station with a tool bag and an expression suggesting the equipment had personally offended him. He replaced the damaged housing, recalibrated the sensors, and installed a simple manual indicator beside the digital system. "Machines are useful," he told Miles, "until someone decides the machine is the only witness." Amos brought the surviving sheep back in stages. He and Miles signed a 2-year operating agreement. Amos managed breeding, grazing rotation, and lambing. Miles handled repairs, water equipment, security, and records. The division suited them. Amos knew when a ewe was sick by the way she held one ear. Miles could trace a wiring fault through 3 patched junction boxes without swearing until the 4th. Helen helped them reduce the flock plan to a size the pasture could support. "Smaller is not failure," she said. "Unsustainable is failure wearing ambition." Miles wrote that sentence on the barn wall in pencil. Nora saw it and added beneath it, "That applies to people too." Bellwether Mercantile changed more slowly. Nora renegotiated the North Range loan through a regional credit union after presenting a new business plan. The store became a shared distribution point for local wool, preserved food, feed supplements, heater parts, and emergency winter supplies. Miles bought the first pallet of mineral blocks through the program. Nora charged him full price. He considered that reassuring. Gideon Pike continued driving deliveries. He was 58, broad through the middle, with a gray mustache and the permanent expression of a man who had seen every road become worse than expected. For months, Rye had accepted food from him only after Gideon backed away. One clear morning, Gideon crouched beside the porch and held out a gloved hand. Rye sniffed it, then allowed Gideon to rest his palm once between the ears. Gideon swallowed hard. "Well," he said, "about time." Rye immediately stole the biscuit from his coat pocket. Trust, Miles thought, did not require dignity. His own hearing appointments continued. The devices made voices clearer but doors too loud. He learned settings, filters, and the humility of asking people to repeat themselves before frustration turned into withdrawal. One evening at the store, Nora spoke while facing a shelf. Miles caught only half the sentence. He did not nod. "Nora." She turned. "I missed that." She repeated it. Nothing in the room broke. That surprised him every time. Near the end of winter, Miles repaired the northern wall. He reset the fallen stones, filled the widest gaps, and reinforced the section near the old maintenance shelter. But he left one low opening where Rye had once pushed his head through the broken masonry. From there, the dog could see the restored ditch line, the gauge station, and beyond it, the pale reach of marsh leading back toward the salmon. The opening was no longer large enough for duty. It was large enough for a view. Miles updated Rye's veterinary registration and identification records. The clerk asked whether he was adopting the dog from the estate. Miles looked at the form. No. The clerk waited. He was mine before the estate existed. Later, he told Nora about it while repairing the heater behind Bellwether Mercantile. She sat on the floor beside an open box of parts, passing him screws when he asked. "So you made it official," she said. "I corrected the paperwork." "That sounds less emotional." "It is safer." "For whom?" Miles tightened the last fitting. "Mostly me." The heater started with a low hum. The work was finished. He packed the tools slowly. Nora made coffee. There was no storm outside, no hearing scheduled, no hidden record, broken gate, or frightened witness waiting to be found. Miles stayed. They sat behind the counter while snow reflected the street lamps through the front windows. Nora talked about expanding the back storeroom. Miles told her Amos had named the newest Ram Senator because it blocked every doorway while contributing nothing useful. She laughed. He heard part of it. He watched the rest. Several weeks later, the first controlled release began. The afternoon was bright, with thin clouds over the peaks and sunlight turning the snow blue around the shadows. Delphine opened the gate under the new dual authorization. Silas watched the manual indicator. Miriam measured temperature downstream. Amos stood near the pasture branch pretending he was not anxious. Water moved beneath the remaining ice. At first, it appeared only as a dark line. Then the line widened. One measured portion turned toward the Corbin meadow. Another continued through the shaded return channel toward the Salmon River. No side received everything. The meadow did not flood with abundance. The river did not transform in an instant. But the water moved where all of them had agreed it should. Rye lay near the opening in the repaired wall. His shoulder remained weaker, and cold still shortened his fourth step. Yet his coat had regained its wheat-gold depth, and the amber-brown eyes no longer tracked every passing truck. Nora stood beside Miles with one hand inside her coat pocket. Rye noticed. He lifted his head. Nora tried to remove the biscuit quietly. Rye took it before she cleared the pocket. "Thief," she said. The dog chewed without remorse. Nora laughed. The tinnitus still threaded through Miles's hearing, thin and permanent. He did not catch every note. He saw the freckles gather beneath Nora's eyes. He saw Silas hide a smile. He saw Amos shake his head at Rye while reaching into his own pocket for another treat. For the first time, missing part of the sound did not feel like losing the moment. Miles rested one hand on the wall. He had not stayed to preserve Elias's legacy exactly as it had been. Some legacies deserved repair more than preservation. He had stayed to keep what remained honest, to surrender what could not be held without harming others, and to build something that did not depend on one proud man carrying every decision alone. Rye lowered his head onto his paws. For 7 years, the dog had guarded a place because the humans around him had left duty, grief, and truth tangled together. Now the gate had witnesses. The records had many hands. The wall had an opening instead of a wound. Rye watched the first returning flow pass beneath the ice. Then, at last, he closed his eyes. Sometimes the hardest thing is not fighting to keep what belongs to us. It is deciding what should be shared, what must be surrendered, and what truth must be told even when it costs us something. Miles did not save the valley by taking everything back. He saved a future by refusing to build it on silence. In our own lives, we may also face moments when doing what is right feels like losing. But grace often begins there, in the quiet choice to protect more than ourselves. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and hard-won hope. May God give you wisdom for the choices ahead and peace with the truth you choose to carry.